I did an episode where I wore blackface. The context was, irrelevant because it's not okay to do blackface ever. But/and there is irony because in this episode, I played an ignorant woman in a liberal bubble who thought she was illuminating racism by wearing blackface. What I didn't realize then is that in reality, I was an ignorant woman in a liberal bubble who thought I was illuminating racism by wearing blackface.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomrin is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey, how has technology altered our relationship with comedy? How do we know when to laugh and when to be outraged? What's even funny anymore?
We're excited to talk with Jacques Berlinerblau, the Rabbi Harold White Professor of Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University and author of the new book, Can We Laugh at That? Comedy in a Conflicted Age. Jacques, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Hi, guys. I'm so happy to be here. So happy.
So, could you tell us about your background and how you got into comedy as a research subject?
I was a cut-up as a child, obviously, like all of us here. But I never formally studied comedy. I studied two separate things that kind of came together and created comedy. One of them was literature. And I realized literature was kind of dying on the vine. Nobody was reading. My students weren't reading. I wasn't reading. But everybody was vibing with comedy over the last 10 years. So I just wanted to take a look at an art form that was growing as opposed to an art form that regrettably was dying. The other thing I do, what I'm known for, is I work on something called political secularism. And one of the great deliverables of a politically secular regime is freedom of speech. And comedy questions and probes and interrogates free speech laws like perhaps no other art form, with the exception of literature.
Other than that, which is a really good connection between literature and comedy, was it an easy, crossover into that world? Are there similarities between literature and comedy that go beyond the free speech zone?
Yeah, because I worked on funny writers. So I worked obviously on Philip Roth. I wrote a book about Philip Roth. That guy's pretty funny. I teach courses on comedic fiction, which is very different from stand-up. That's the thing I've always got to explain. This is not stand-up comedy. Like writing a joke and telling a joke are two totally different artistic genres. So I work on writers like Paul Beatty. I can find the humor in Nabokov, right? So I was always looking for the funny written word. So I think I had some credibility to make the transition. I don't think this came completely out of left field. I was always trying to understand why things were funny. And of course, that's how you make them really unfunny. It's like Freud's analysis of jokes. Remember that? He's like breaking these jokes down and you're not laughing. So as soon as you subject comedy to analysis, I regret to say you pull out the quality that makes it so special, but you understand it, which is really important.
Yeah, I think the funniest thing about Freud's book about jokes is that Freud wrote a book about jokes.
He thought he was very funny. I mean, you can tell, like when he pulls out of telling you a joke and explaining it, he's like, excellent, a wonderful joke, a most amusing bromide.
You observe that stand-up comedy is at the center of today's free speech controversies. Why is that?
There's something about stand-up. Stand-up is emerging as this art form that we have to think about really, really carefully. I think stand-up, unlike other art forms, and I can do this bit that I always do, like art forms that don't translate well to the internet, stand-up is like genetically coded and built to translate to the digital world, right? So a comedian standing in front of a brick wall, it's very, very low tech. Somebody's got a little camera. They tell a joke. The joke usually lasts, 5 to 15 to 20 seconds. Boom, right? You snap it, you download it, you post, and it's there. You can't do that with ballet. I want to do this bit. You can't do that. It's really hard to do with jazz. Jazz is one of my great loves. I'm a failed jazz musician. And you can't do it with glass blowing. Like, so every glass blower listening to this show is like, this guy gets me, right? He understands who I am and what I deal with as a glass blower. Comedy just translates. I don't know. It's like the internet and comedy have what Max Weber would call an elective affinity. They found one another for better and maybe for worse.
Something that I think sort of bridges the gap. You know, my in-laws have a XM radio, and there's a couple of comedy channels on there. And it's always a little bit weird hearing these comics I've never heard of before telling jokes, but it also sort of works. There's also that, Comics Unleashed show that's now taking over for Colbert. And I'm also thinking, recently we did an episode about Rodney Dangerfield, and I could pull out any joke from that book and tell it to my family, and they were still hilarious, with or without the Rodney Dangerfield accent. So there is something kind of, I guess, the tidbit nature of it that seems like the jokes work so well.
Yeah. So Joey, I do exactly what you do. For 5 years, I've been listening to those XM comedy shows, and I've learned that when you listen to a second-tier comedian, you learn a lot about comedy. Like when you hear a stand-up struggling, I'm like, oh, no, the timing's off, right? Oh, we should have waited for. It's so easy, obviously, for me to say that, not having done stand-up. But XM is this great tool because they've got like 5 different comedy channels there, right? They're like Kevin Hart's got a channel, right? Then there's like some Southern Bubba channel, right? And I listen to them all. But one thing that I really get listening to comedy, I don't know if you've noticed this, Joey, is these guys must have a lot of heart attacks and strokes on stage, right? So you're listening to a comedian and the audience is laughing and their voices are rising. So if you ever listen to like a 7 or 10 minute set, the difference, like the cadence or the rhythm between where it was when it started and where it is, where it ended, I just think this would be a great statistic, right? Comedians that have stroked out on stage, comedians rushed to the emergency room. I know that very funny comedian, Glass, he had a heart attack. I think it's very, very common, and it's just something about this art form. You've got this audience in front of you, and you're getting excited, and you're talking louder and louder and faster, and then coronary complications ensue.
I'm also thinking about the 3 Mitch Hedberg albums, 2 of which were released when he was alive and 1 which was posthumous. All have very different feels. The first one, sounds very much influenced by weed, I would say. And the latter 2 seem like maybe different substances. But his last one that was posthumous is like pretty frenetic. So it's almost like he got more and more frenetic over the course of his career in a way. But also I had a comedy DVD of Mitch Hedberg's, and I remember watching the uncut version of it and seeing a full comedic roller coaster of him like kind of bombing and then sort of picking it up and getting the audience with him, and then watching the Comedy Central edited version, which was all of the best hits and really like syncing it together in a perfect way that is not entirely accurate, but works much better for a half hour of TV.
Joey, is there like a drug narrative here? I really do want to talk about drugs and art because I've been thinking about this a lot. So are you saying that either weed or cocaine or something was infusing these sets?
Yeah, I mean, Mitch Hedberg, my favorite joke of his is, or one of the, I can use honestly say a joke for everything that happens in my life, but his joke was, I used to do drugs. I still do, but I used to too. His first set, very laid back and probably under the influence of marijuana. He has a stand-up bass player who's kind of keeping the flow going in a jazzy, cool way. And then his second album is a lot more kind of, I would say, drunk. He seems like he's a lot more loose and kind of happy-go-lucky. And then the posthumous album really did seem like it could have been cocaine or something like that because he was very high energy.
So I've been thinking a lot about drugs and art. So I forget the author. Let's find him. He wrote something about heroin and the New York art scene in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Is it heroin and music in New York City?
That's it. Barry Spine. The argument was that drug and comedy, right? The drug infiltrated the aesthetic, right? And it became part of the aesthetic. And then I was thinking, I'm not going to mention names because some of these guys are still alive, fusion drummers in the early 70s, right? So if you're listening to these guys, they're drum fills. I don't know if you guys play drums. I used to play drums, right? these are like these massive drum fills, like, right? And somebody whispered in my ear, yeah, that's because they had just discovered cocaine, right? So cocaine was driving the sound of a very particular type of jazz offshoot known as fusion jazz. So I've been thinking a lot about the way drugs impact art. Classical musicians are telling me about beta blockers of late. They get so nervous that they want to slow down their heart rate. So I just think there's a great book to be written, maybe by Joey, maybe by Jonathan, maybe by Mike, I don't know, about drugs and art.
Well, I think comedic controversies and drugs come together in the person of Lenny Bruce, if you want to tell us a little bit about him and how he maybe foreshadowed some of the controversies of today.
Yeah, Lenny Bruce look, I'm going to be very honest. When I listen to Lenny Bruce now, it's hard for me to laugh, right? So you're force-fed this idea. This guy was a genius, right? He was an icon, and I'm sure he was. But I'm just not finding it funny. And that's something weird about comedy, that it tends to be very time and place specific, right? So unless you know what companies he's referring to and what politicians, right? You can hear the genius and the cadences, and there's a lot of stuff that he did in his life, which is just non pareil, right? All right, so Lenny Bruce, why is Lenny Bruce interesting? Lenny Bruce was in many ways a precursor to what we're seeing today. Before there was the internet, Lenny Bruce didn't need the internet, right, to get himself into all sorts of trouble. He's the classic example of a comedian who makes a joke that people really, really don't find funny, and they get organized into a coherent block, and they try to shut him down. The case is really, really tragic because, as we know, this eventually led to his suicide, right? We know that he was addicted to heroin, but Lenny Bruce would play clubs around the country, and local law enforcement, not federal, local law enforcement would be in attendance, and they'd just be like ticks, ready to descend on a deer, right? They'd just be waiting for him to say those words that could not be said, whatever, cocksucker, whatever it was. And then they would arrest him. What I found kind of cool is I read an account of Lenny Bruce in which he was arrested, I believe it was in San Francisco, at 9:30, arrested, booked, released, and came back for like the 11:30 set and made jokes about the whole process, right? And that, to me, I was like, aha, he really is a pioneer. Because what I noticed in like Dave Chappelle's work or Kathy Griffin's work, to a certain degree, Shane Gillis, is they would bring the controversies that their jokes created back into their jokes. And that is a really combustive recipe. You want to piss people off, do that, all right? Make your set about people getting annoyed at the jokes you made in your previous set. And Chappelle went down this road for like 5 specials running, especially in the closer. And I don't think it did anyone any good. All right, I don't think it was good for his mental health, which I was somewhat concerned about. I don't think it's good for comedy. I don't think it's good for audiences to be in this like rah-rah mode where like, you get them, Dave, you show those LGBTQ, right? So that move, I believe Lenny Bruce was the first person I know of who did it. And then there was like 30 years where I don't think people were doing it because they didn't have to, right? Comedy, free speech was in a place where people could say whatever they wanted. You could complain, but for the most part, you weren't going to get canceled. Because of the internet, cancellation is now a real possibility. It's almost like a quotidian workday reality for the American comedian.
And as you're saying this, I mean, Chappelle's work as he's in this loop, as you describe it in the book, is also not very funny when he's commenting on his controversy, and it just becomes sort of a lecture, rant, existential, whatever, and it's not really funny.
It feels like a political rally, right? Now, Chappelle is a genius, right? We can't deny that, right? This guy is a master of his craft. But I think his craft suffered because he got into what I call this loop, right? This feedback loop where he's so mad at the critics and the critics won't back down. And it degrades everything. It degrades the comedy, it degrades the comedian, and it degrades the audiences. So I would urge comedians, do you guys have a large listenership of comedians? I imagine you do. Maybe they have to learn how to like let it go, right? Like really, really let it go. I'm thinking about Chris Rock. Remember Selective Outrage, remember that? And everybody is waiting for him to talk about Will Smith. Everyone, right? I thought what was cool about Selective Outrage is the punch was the last joke, right? He did not spend his entire set complaining about being punched in the face in front of like 1 billion people. And it was a great line. You know, people asked me why I didn't punch him back, right? Pause, right? Because my parents taught me don't fight in front of white people. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. I mean, that smoked the room. The room's going crazy. He drops the microphone. He literally dropped the microphone and out. So I think Chris Rock understood the deformation to one's art that will occur if one becomes obsessed by their own controversies.
Is it possible to separate comedians from their comedy?
Stand-ups, no. I mean, like, you know, stand-ups, they're like right there, right, in front of you, in their own body, under their own name. I'm sure there have been stand-ups that go in a kind of drag or in costumes under stage names, and nobody actually knows who they are. I think stand-up is a very interesting art form in that it's so embodied, like it's your physical body, it's often your name. You know, a stand-up usually will begin by making a derogatory reference to their own body, right? I mean, I once saw a guy with a t-shirt, he was this humongous guy, right? And he had a t-shirt that said DILF on it. And it just was cracking me up. I don't know why. It was just so funny, right? He was like some second-tier comedian. It said DILF, right? And he was just talking about his body the entire set. Is he the same person as his persona? No, right? The persona is this thing he radiates for 15 or 10 minutes on stage, right? The person is the guy who goes home and, you know, smokes grass and, you know, has a family. But there's this Venn diagram like overlap in stand-up comedy, which makes it a very volatile and I think fascinating art form, right? I'd love to spend 10 years, right, studying the mechanics of stand-up, but unfortunately I've got other projects in the works.
There are examples like Dame Edna and Tony Clifton, right, who are alter egos for comedians. But I think even someone like Don Rickles, who would, you know, say that when he goes on stage and he's the biggest jerk in the world, it's just an act. And that, you know, his friends and acquaintances would confirm that he was a really nice guy otherwise, right? I don't know if there's that same differentiation now because of social media and everybody's sort of presenting themselves in their character online as a brand, you know?
Really good point. I think the energy or the torque of social media is like, be yourself, right? Be who you are and post a lot. I think that's really also bad for comedians, this bottomless pit of talking about the self and promoting the self. I mean, I have 2 sons that are artists, and one of them is a musician. He's always posting these little snippets of his. I'm like, you didn't need to post that. It wasn't that good, dude. I mean, it was fine. You've done better. But as he explains it to me, he's like, that's what we all do, right? We all play and we take like the best 30, 40 seconds and we do a little Instagram, right? Here's something that's interesting. I was reading about a South African comedian who walked into the biggest comedy club in South Africa. I guess it was in Pretoria or Johannesburg. And he had like a tape. And he was like, sir, here's my tape. And the guy said, I don't want to see your tape. Show me your Instagram. I want to see how many followers you have. That's really interesting, right? And he had like 10,000 followers. He said, okay, you get a 5-minute spot. And I think that's the way the technology is changing the art form, probably not for the better, right? So there's this relentless pressure on artists in so many fields, even the glassblowers, who we mentioned earlier, right? To show the world that they have all these followers, right? I've been stuck on like 1,500 Twitter followers for like 8 years, and I wear it like a badge of honor, right? Like I cannot get past 1,500. I feel I'm doing something right? I mean, 1,200 of them are like bots anyhow, right? So to those 300 people, I salute you. And to the 4 or 5 billion that aren't following me, I salute you as well, right? You validate what I do. My project.
I was watching a lecture by an art historian today talking about how, you know, back in the day, Picasso and Michelangelo and all the greats, they didn't need that kind of nonsense. And maybe, as he was saying, you know, if they had to kind of post like process images of their work or whatever, it would have gotten in the way of the actual artwork.
Yep. So you think of like J.D. Salinger, even Philip Roth. I mean, so many writers that I studied just did not want to be in the public eye. And probably what they understood is that's crack cocaine. That's dangerous stuff, right? Being out. And it's bad for my art. But I don't think the young generation of artists has much of a choice. And that's a problem. That's a real problem.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
What is the pre-digital liberal free speech consensus, and how is it challenged in our social media world?
Yeah, that was the part of the book where I imagine a lot of the comedians would be like, blah, 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 blah. Like they were just like if comedians were reading this, they might tune out there, because I had to work through a lot of jurisprudence and Supreme Court cases. And that comes from the research I did on political secularism. Suffice it to say that between 1957 to like 1965, there was a tectonic shift in how we thought about free speech in the United States, and like the gates opened. And vis-a-vis comedy, the idea was it's just a goddamn joke. If you don't like it, don't purchase it or don't go to the club. Let it live, let it breathe. Even if it's offensive, let it live, let it breathe, right? A strong democracy. And now we're going back to John Stuart Mill on liberty and Emile Durkheim, right? A democracy thrives when it can process or it can absorb really bad, mean-spirited jokes, right? And that's in the pre-digital age. And I think that law was commensurate with the age. It made a lot of sense, right? But now we have this new technology. And as I read reviews of my book, a lot of folks are not comfortable with what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is this new technology means we might have to rethink some of our free speech givens, right? Why? Because with this new technology, you can make a joke about Jews or Palestinians. And you can make this joke about Jews or Palestinians in a part of the world where they're a minority. And then really bad repercussions can ensue from your joke, right? Because it's out there, you're making fun of them. So I think about LGBTQ folk in particular, right? Jokes are made at their expense. They're multiplied online. Somebody's at the water cooler. They hear this joke. It undermines their self-esteem. So this pre-digital liberal free speech consensus is under attack globally. It's under attack from the far right and the far left. That's what my 6th chapter about a French comedian called Dieudonné is about. I don't think it deserves to be under attack, but I think liberal theorists, and I call myself a liberal theorist, have to like rethink free speech. Mr. Madison wasn't on Twitter. He didn't have Instagram, right? He didn't understand that power. And that power is really negative. So I don't want to sound too Luddite about things, but the advent of digital technology and the internet, I feel, has changed the free speech game. Now, when I was reading reports from free speech oversight organizations, right, free speech watchdogs, they were all saying the same thing, even though we disagree on what the solution is. They were saying it's a paradox that in the age of the internet, we are finding more crackdowns on expressive liberty than prior to isn't that a paradox, right? So now governments, India is an example, Venezuela is an example, Cuba is an example, China is an example, right? They're looking at what the internet puts out there, and they're creating laws or trying to create laws that circumscribe what can be said on the internet, right? So it's a double-edged sword, right? The internet permitted all this speech, and it also led the powers that be to find ingenious ways to crack down.
Maybe one of the things that the internet has done is sort of exposed the dark side of humanity in a way that, previously it was a little more structured in terms of who gets to have the microphone, what stories are written and printed, and there were more official organs that sort of curated that stuff.
Yeah, I think it showed us something. I mean, we're monkeys, right? We're simians, right? The internet taught us something about ourselves that I don't think we actually knew. I think fictionalists and novelists knew it, but we're learning, like, we're bullies, right? When you're liking that snarky internet, right? You're feeling good. because somebody got their face punched in on Twitter. You know, now that Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, right? He keeps moving me to the For You tab. And the For You tab is people getting punched in the face for being bad guys, right? You know, they fucked around and they found out. And there's this little part in me, it's like, yeah, punch him in the face, hit him again, right? And I'm not the only one, right? I'm a thoughtful professor, right? So I think the internet, exactly as you said, Jonathan, is teaching us something about ourselves which some of us knew. But this thing we're learning about human beings is not good, right? And this is where lawmakers have to step in. This is where religious leaders have to step in, right? Policy analysts, like, people need to think this through. This stuff is potent, absolutely potent.
What role does the audience play in determining the boundaries of humor?
I received a doctorate. I have 2 doctorates. I think I should mention that humbly. I received a doctorate in sociology. I didn't use it much. I used the other doctorate a lot in ancient languages and literature. But to the sociologist, the comedian isn't interesting. That's right. What's interesting is the audience, right? To the sociologist, the prophet isn't interesting, to quote Max Weber. It's those that recognize the prophet as a bearer of charisma or great wisdom. So I'm really interested in audiences. And what I wanted to do in the book was think about the power of comedic audiences, right, to shape the art form and shape the discourse around the art form. So one type of audience I was looking at are negative audiences, right? Audiences that hear a joke and they get so upset that they organize and they marshal their resources and they try to punish the comedian, right? Now, the audience in question can be, you know, totally decent citizens. It can be vigilantes. It can be a government. It can be a militia. It can be a terrorist cell, right? So those are audiences. So I was looking at all these negative audiences, and negative audiences have this really bad habit of wanting to censor, shut down, lock down certain types of jokes. The complicated question is, are there certain types of jokes that just shouldn't be told? I think 99 out of 100 comedians would say, insane, that's wrong, right? Any joke can and should. And I used to believe that before the internet. Prior to the internet, I was with the comedians, and now I'm like, oh, these jokes can be weaponized. These jokes can have really deleterious effects on human beings. I'm interrogating that. One of the criticisms of the book, which I'm not vibing with, is this guy is like so convoluted about what he actually feels. I am. That's my job. My job is not to come to a conclusion and to prescribe and to suggest a policy. I'm very confused by what we do with jokes that lacerate and hurt large groups of people and might downstream have negative impacts resulting in violence. I don't know what to do with that type of humor. And instead of being, you know, we've got to protect it or we've got to shut it down, I want to create a space where people can sort of reflect together as to what the best course of action is.
Speaking of audiences, I know there was controversy around some classic films like The Life of Brian and The Producers and things like this. And yet those films sort of persisted in that pre-digital age as classics and have sort of, you know, grown on people, I think, over the years. I don't know if that nuance is still there in terms of how we respond to stuff. Because I know, again, there were controversies, but they didn't win the day in the way that today's cancelers are.
Cinema's big, though, right? I mean, cinema, like when you see the credits, if you ever count, as I have, right, because I have OCD, if you ever like count how many people, they're often like 1,000 people in those credits, right? So cinema is this like collective artistic project, which means there's somebody very wealthy or a studio, right, or backers, or capitalism is like back there, right? So I think movies like that, yes, there was an outcry, but they were big studios, let's just, I don't know, Paramount, CBS, Arista Records, whatever, right? That could push back. With comedians, it's a little bit different because they are fundamentally individuals, especially at the beginning of their career. So Netflix protected Dave Chappelle as well, I think it should have, right? Though that's complicated. But a young comedian making a really, really inappropriate joke doesn't have a studio behind them, right? They don't have lawyers, right? They don't have capital backing them up. So I'm interested in you bringing cinema into this conversation. I just think there's something really, really unique about these stand-ups, right, with their little microphones at Yuck Yucks in Fort Wayne, Indiana, right? And somebody captures 30 seconds of some of their LGBTQ jokes, right? And the next thing you know, one, they've been canceled, and national, right, LGBTQ advocacy groups are complaining about them, right? I don't know. There's a scene in Curb Your Enthusiasm where somebody's making a Mexican joke. Remember that? And Jeff says, that joke is not funny. Do you remember that? Right? I thought it was like Larry David was like actually asking the same question, right? The Curb Your Enthusiasm. Like, what types of jokes are no longer funny? I find anti-Asian jokes really not funny. Like when Joe Rogan is, doing like so-called yellow voice, I'm just like, I wish you'd stop. Like, stop doing this, right? Please. It's like done, right? Buddy Hackett, right? He used to do like Chinese restaurant bits in the 40s and 50s. Like, let it go. So there are like so many jokes that I hear, and I just don't want to hear them. Now, maybe that's because I'm closed-minded. I'm a Philistine, right? But I feel I know where these jokes lead collectively, right? They lead to psychic pain for lots of people over aspects of their identity, which one, they're proud of, and two, they couldn't change, and three, they wouldn't change, even if they could. So do I have an answer, gentlemen? No, I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking really, really hard about what we do with comedians that want to make these jokes. One rule I suggest in the book is flay your own. Like any Jew I can make Jewish jokes. I can make Holocaust jokes. My ancestors of blessed memory perished in the, so I can make those jokes. I feel I have a license to make those jokes. I'm not going to make jokes about my black brothers and sisters, right? I'm not going to make jokes about the slave trade. It's like not my place. I don't want to do it, right? I'd love to hear what comedians say. Comedians always are like, oh, I'm an equal opportunity offender. That's something comedians are. I insult everyone. I don't know if that's even possible because there's so many people to insult. And invariably, comedians have like grooves, right? They have go-tos. They keep going back to certain types of jokes. Sorry if I spoke too much, guys. I get very excised by this subject.
Where do political cartoons fit in this?
Cartoons, I had to read that book by Jit Clausen. It's called The Cartoons That Shook the World. I would recommend it to everyone listening. So good, such good scholarship, so clearly written. I love scholarship like that. And she was making an argument which I'd never thought of. And then I started reading more about cartoons. Victor something or other wrote a book about the history of cartoons. Apparently cartoons have an uncanny ability to piss people off. I did not know that because they're visual after all, right? And you have like, I was reading some studies of African comedy, right? Across the continent of Africa. And when shit gets real, it's usually involving a cartoon, not a stand-up, right? So there was a famous incident in South Africa with Jacob Zuma. There are incidents in Kenya in particular. There's something about cartoons. Now think about Charlie Hebdo, right? There's something about cartoons that drives fundamentalists insane, sends them off the rails, right? If you think of these little Charlie Hebdo, they're these little tiny things, right? These dumb things with like guys with dicks on their heads and whatnot, right? Drives them to utter distraction and violence. So what I learned from the Jit Clausen book is the way stand-up is one genre of political comedy, cartoons are another, and they might even be more volatile. Here's another one which we don't think about in the United States, puppetry. I've been looking at African comedy troupes that do puppetry, and apparently this stuff is like nitroglycerin, right? It really gets them in trouble, and the puppetry is absolutely like hysterical. I believe the troupe's name is XYZ, right? It's a Kenyan guy who studied in France, and he does these kind of puppetry send-ups of African despots, and they're so funny, right? They're so hysterically funny. They also get the artists into a metric ton of trouble.
What can we, as secular Jews who are proud of our comedic heritage, draw from your study of comedy in these conflicted times?
Boy, guys, it's such a rough time to be a Jew in the United States. And I say that, and I know it's a real rough time to be a Palestinian and, in Palestine, Israel, Palestine, and a Palestinian in the United States. But I've never been at more of an impasse in my thinking about Judaism and what Judaism should be doing, right, as an American Jew than I am right now. I think secular humanistic Judaism has like certain core values which are really, really important to this conversation, right? One, as I understood secular humanistic Judaism, it always had a tremendous emphasis on untrammeled freedom of speech and expressive liberty. It is, in a way, encased in the amber of what I call the pre-digital liberal free speech consensus, right? That's where I came from. I think that's where you guys came from, right? Make the jokes, all right? It's better this way. Don't censor anything. But another thing I like about secular Judaism is, like many liberal faiths, liberal Islam, liberal Protestantism, liberal Catholicism, it retains a capacity to say, maybe we should think about that. Maybe we were wrong. I do like that about all liberal denominations in the United States, right? They acknowledge the possibility of error. So what I appreciate about secular forms of Judaism is the idea that, no, we're not getting this on high from God. We are not in unique possession of God's writ and revelation. We're human beings, like the rabbis of blessed memory, kind of struggling together to figure out what the proper course of action is. So I think the best secular value, and I'm not saying this isn't present in Orthodoxy or conservative Judaism, though I don't know if it's present in ultra-Orthodoxy, is this process of communal reflection and deliberation where considerations of power are not dominant, right? It's not because somebody's more powerful that they, right? So I do think secular Judaism is a religion or a religious tradition in which interesting conversations, painful conversations can be had under certain conditions. And that's what I think is a great strength, right, of the secular humanistic tradition. It's like, all right, let's talk this through, and let's not talk it through knowing what our conclusions are going to be, nor let us assume that certain talkers are more powerful or more important than others. So there's something very democratizing in secular humanistic Judaism. So guys, that's a really long answer. That's what I would hope, and that's what I like about the secular tradition. And I feel, we're good talkers, we listen to one another, right? And we're powerless, right? It's kind of a small cohort of Jews these days, the secular humanistic Jews. And as I think I mentioned earlier, that's where I like to be. That's why I have 1,500 Twitter followers. I just think too much power for any human being is not good. Too much power for any religion is not good. And this particular denomination of American Judaism, secular humanism, fulfills all those criteria, right, of not being particularly powerful or populist. So maybe some of the best conversations can happen there.
Applying that to comedy, you would say the best approach to comedic controversies is to talk it out and figure out some limits or some liberties and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's problematic, right? From the second you get the internet and you get, massive entertainment conglomerates involved, and now you have the FCC involved, it's really hard. For intellectuals, and that's what we are, for intellectuals and artists, we've got to talk it out amongst ourselves, right? What nation states, what conglomerates, right? What streamers do, that's up to them, and that's often dictated by anything but the conclusions that we would reach in a group. But I do think it's important for intelligent people with expertise and knowledge to sit around and to talk to one another. I'd love to have comedians not be filmed, right? And get in a room and like respond to some of the things we've said today. Like, hey guys, maybe there's certain jokes you just shouldn't. I'd love to hear a comedian, knowing they're not being recorded, talk to me about his or her or their experiences on the road with a particular joke that they understood really pissed people off. So they said, you know what, I'm not going to tell this joke. It's a great joke, but I'm not going to tell it because the human toll is too much. I'm sure I've spoken to comedians who have stories like that about jokes they just don't want to tell anymore, even though they think they're very funny.
Or they may tell a joke to one audience and not to another.
Yeah, that's a little bit a sort of fishy moral code, right? Like but Yeah, it just reminds me like how powerful humor is as like a human, as like a tool of human interaction. You know, Freud was on to something, to go back to Freud, right? I mean, I don't think his analysis was correct, but at a time when not many people were looking at comedy, comedy is never taken seriously. Like, why didn't Eddie Murphy get the Oscar for Norbert? I'm not kidding, right? I'm like, he should have won. That is an amazing performance, right? But because it was comedy, and because he had about 275 pounds of like makeup and flab and fat jackets on, right? But if you look at the acting in that, I imagine some actors are just rolling their eyes right now, but damn it, I'm gonna die on this hill. He should have won some major award for playing all those roles. Why didn't he? Because we don't take comedy seriously. Back to Freud, I think Freud understood, take it very seriously. Of course, he had to go through the unconscious, right, to justify all of that. But I've been taking comedy like dead serious. And when I go to comedy clubs, I get called out by the comedians. It's like, they're, you asshole. They're always like because my posture is wrong, right? I'm not drunk. I'm like sitting there, like taking them so seriously. And they notice this like big, lanky, dorky white dude who's unlike all the other objects in the room, right? I'm like, I'm not whooping and I'm just looking at them like this. And it's uncanny how they pick me out, right? I can't even hide from these guys, right? One guy called me like a smug motherfucker, like 12 seconds into the show, right? It's like, wow, these guys are really good because comedians understand their audiences. That's what I like about them. They really like develop this like symbiotic relationship with laughter. A comedian told me that he could distinguish the laughter. Like he had like categories like, oh, when I hear people laughing like this, I know surge forward. But when I hear this type of laughter, it's like back off, right? Slow it down. They're so good. I love art forms where people work with audiences like that. God bless performing artists. God bless musicians, right? Poets, right? Theater actors, people that deal with live audiences. Love that stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Jacques, for joining us.
This was so fun. We should do this again, guys.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.